blinded in the next session, won't I?
Good morning. My name is Rupa Pike. I am the Global Head of Strategic Alliances for Cell Therapy at Catalent. Today, I have the distinct honor of moderating the panel entitled Expanding Access to CAR T Therapies, Overcoming Barriers and Driving Adoption. As we all know, cell therapies, especially CAR T therapies, have revolutionized the field of medicine by being curative in nature. And within a very short time, they have achieved unprecedented success, as evident by the fact that we have 7 CAR T therapies approved in the US, 6 in EU, 4 in UK, and 6 in Japan, not to mention India and China. We have also seen many of these therapies become second line of treatment and some earlier lines of treatment, hoping that it will become standard of care in the near future. We have seen a lot of advancement in utilization of CAR T therapies for non-oncology indications, such as treatment of immune disorders or autoimmune disorders. And also we have seen a lot of progress in the in vivo CAR T space. So in spite of all these advancements, challenges still remain. And one of the biggest challenge is access to CAR T therapies for patients. There are many reports that say that for every 10 patients that are eligible for CAR T therapies, only 2 receive it. So today, we have a distinguished group of leaders here with us who have spent a lot of years in the space of access, reimbursement, market access, analysis. They all have one thing in common, which is through all the years that they have worked, they have strived to put the patient first. So I'm going to go ahead and make introductions. I'm going to go with Phung, because ladies first. So Dr. Phung Osborn, she's currently the Vice President of Global Market Access for Cell Therapy at Bristol Myers Squibb. Prior to joining Bristol Myers Squibb, she served as Vice President of Market Access at Orca Bio and Vifor CSL. She was a leader at Iovance for US payers and access, and has a long and successful career dedicated to market access, pricing, and reimbursement functions. Next, I'm going to start with David. David is the COO and CBO of Umoja Therapeutics. Prior to that, he was the Vice President for Cell Therapy franchise at BMS. He served as the Global Program Leader at Juno for Breyanzi, quite a feat there. And prior to that, he was the Vice President of Immuno-Oncology at Pfizer. Next, after Phung, we have Dr. Dilip Patel. He's the Senior Vice President and Global Access and Market Development at Autolus. Interestingly, Dilip has also served as the VP of EU Market Access for Alliance for Regenerative Medicine. He has held similar leadership roles at Meteor, Kite, Novartis, and Sobi, and is an expert in NHS policies for market access. He also has a deep understanding of EU landscape. And last but not least, we have Dr. Panteli Theocharous. Panteli is the Chief Therapeutic Officer and Head of Medical and Scientific Affairs at Garuda. Panteli also served as Global VP and Cell and Gene Therapy Strategy Lead at PPD for several years. Prior to that, he held the roles of CMO and Global Medical Affairs at Cell Therapies. He had a similar role at Janssen and has deep expertise when it comes also to the working of NHS. And his motto is patient first, and I've known Panteli for many years. So this is our distinguished panel. We're going to start our discussion, and for the sake of discussion, we are dividing the topic into 4 buckets. We will start with complex infrastructure, then we will move to financial barriers, then barriers to patient access, and we will finish with manufacturing costs and cost of goods, if that's okay with you. So starting with complex infrastructure, as we all know, access to CAR T therapies is dependent on a complex interplay of a variety of factors. Some of them are patient referral, patient selection, payer authorization, just to name a few. Can you comment on each of your experiences with this complex infrastructure and what can be done to minimize these barriers? And I'm going to start with Phung, please.
Thanks, Rupa. I think there's so much to say here, right? And if we start and take a look at what Rupa said about only 2 out of 10 patients are receiving CAR T today, and what we recognize throughout this process, so even from my early days on these startup companies and now at Bristol Myers, what we see is at each step for the patient, from referral on, and even before that, right, it's a really complex system. So what we're doing at Bristol Myers, and I'm going to break it up to referral first, is really stepping back and saying, who do we have to educate? So when you look at this, and across, regardless now, so I have US and worldwide, regardless of what country I'm in, the referral pattern is the same. There is a hesitancy from the community or the prescribing physician, or the managing physician, I should say, to really advance to CAR T. And I think a lot of that is we still have a hangover from the early days of CAR T, where there was a lot of concern around the neurotoxicity as well as an understanding of what CAR T is for the patients. So we see that from an education perspective is we need to take a step back and educate across the ecosystem. And then when we look at the patient, it's not only about, so if they've been selected or now prescribed a CAR T, the decision that patient has to make, it's not about getting the therapy, it's about that logistical process. So I need a caregiver, I have to go away from my home for 4 weeks or more. There's all of these other interdependencies just for that patient that they have to make that decision. Can they financially afford it? Can they from a logistical standpoint, right? And I think from a BMS perspective, what we're looking at, and actually it was something David started years back, so thank you, is saying, can we go beyond the academic centers? What we have learned throughout the last 8 years is that the product and the processes is actually quite safe and not as laborious as we made them in the early years, that we can expand to maybe getting this closer to the patient's home. We know that patients do better when they are with their caregivers, with their family, and have that ecosystem to support them. So the right thing to do is to go beyond the academic centers. That adds another layer of complexity, again, education to the community and expressing why it's important. But from a safety, quality, efficacy standpoint, we now know enough and we have real world evidence, which I think that's the next piece, right, is making sure that all of the companies who are active now in commercialization and as you move towards that, is having a really good plan for real world evidence and making sure that we're expressing that and sharing it both at a patient caregiver ability to understand all the way through the treating physicians. And then when we look at coverage and reimbursement, I think we can all say a lot about that. If I look at it from a US perspective, coverage is not my issue, it's reimbursement. Can we pay for the provider to be able to acquire the product in a way that they can continue this practice? Can we solve for issues within the academic center now, especially in light of some of the other funding processes? When we go to the EU and even Japan, it's the same issues. It's from a viability and sustainability of ordering these products. Can we do that? And I think we're all looking at different mechanisms to say, can we reduce our manufacturing, reduce the COGS? But from a sustainability, it really comes down to the reimbursement to be able to get to all the patients. So there's a lot to solve, but I think each of us are taking a bit at a time, and I think we need to learn from each other and work together as an industry, because I think that's the only way we're going to bring these products to more patients.
Thank you. Anyone else need to add?
Yeah, maybe just a couple of quick comments. First of all, just to thank and acknowledge Arm for really being part of this esteemed panel. So thank you in advance for that. I think I just kind of look at it a little bit more from that from that patient journey perspective. Having been in the NHS for 10 years in the early part of my career, and really being humbled around being part of a team that actually established the allogeneic stem cell transplant program at the Royal Free in London. And I think I kind of look at it now in terms of the innovation, our ability to really work on these transformational therapies. What does that actually mean in terms of the infrastructure? So we think about, the clinical trial side or the hospital, for example, access to apheresis, access to the specialization that is necessary to be able to take that patient through the journey, manage very distinct and very specific toxicities, for example. I agree. I think it's, it's a system of being able to, engage, to be able to educate, to develop the tools, to be able to engage the patient directly. But how can we also almost kind of achieve that very practical equipoise when it comes to being able to access certain services, at the level of the hospital or the treatment center, for example, particularly now as we see the diversification, moving from hematology into oncology into other really exciting therapeutic areas, but there's still a reliance on being able to navigate a multidisciplinary approach at the level of the hospital and center.
I would just add, I'm fortunate enough to have commercialized 2 cell therapies. First of all, Yescarta at Kite Gilead, and then most recently at Autolus with Patel in the States, and then soon in Europe and the UK. So I kind of have a unique, perspective on it. And I think certainly so far as hem-onc indications are concerned in the early days of CAR-T, as Phung has already quite eloquently described, the healthcare resource utilization that was required, to administer a CAR-T was considerable, and probably still is considerable in terms of requiring, ITU beds and so on and so forth. And I still can recall in sort of 2017, 2018, having these discussions with NHS, policyholders and with customers in the US around, well, we haven't got an ITU bed to, leave free for a CAR-T patient for 4 days or 5 days. So I guess what I'm trying to get to is the fact that I think as the new generations of CAR-Ts, if you want to call them that, have come along, that's kind of slightly helped that scenario, because the adverse events are a little bit more manageable. Physicians have learned how to manage those adverse events. And certainly I think the big ones are CRS and ICANS, which are becoming manageable, and then these newer products are, safe. So where's that going to? So that's going to outpatient, infusion, and that's really how, in my opinion, we're going to expand in the context of this debate, the infusion of CAR-Ts, and how are they going to make them more accessible in terms of some of the points that Panteli and Phung have addressed. But let me just give you an idea of Sarah Cannon, because this is not just about telling you what you already know. But for example, with Sarah Cannon, and you may or may not know, but they have a fully outpatient infused CAR-T cell model. And some of the things that they do and have done and are doing is to introduce digital management of patients once they leave the hospital setting. So they have, for example, a nurse that is on standby, who essentially is offering telemed, who is in contact with the carer and the patient, and as soon as they hear that there's going to be an ICANS event, they'll go and phone a physician, and then the patient will come in. So that's an evolution of the model where we started with the early CAR-Ts. And I think that, I hope, will continue, and it has to continue. If you look to the future, and you look at forecasts, by 2023, they're expecting some $200 billion of cell and gene therapy, which means that they're going to go into indications such as SLE and other kind of broader indications. So the point of care, the site of care, is going to have to move from an inpatient setting into that outpatient setting. So there's an example of an institution that's using modern ways to manage patients outside of an inpatient setting, and I think that's the direction of travel.
And I think to go on to that point is, if you look at France and Italy and Japan, they're doing actually very similar things. But I think the other connectivity that we see that's really exciting is that we see these countries talking to each other. The treating physicians are talking about, what does that outpatient management look like? How do I use digital, how are we going to do remote monitoring? So I think what we're going to see is a new standard, and across the world, we're seeing that you can go to outpatient and do it very well and do it in a manner that is more cost effective. So I think what we're going to see as you build onto this with other companies is really a new way of managing these patients that are more efficient.
David
was going to
We're all
comment.
excited
Go
about
ahead.
this.
This topic usually frustrates me more than I'm passionate about it, but I wanted to bring what the group is saying to life. Phung mentioned that Juno, we did BMS Juno, we did a very interesting study early on where we decided we need to bring this product to outpatients. So we worked with Sarah Cannon in Florida Oncology in 2 studies. One was called Outreach, and another one was called Pilot. So Pilot was second line transplant non-eligible patients, and Outreach was third line plus the traditional label. And the reason why I want to highlight those is I was just reminded the other day that in those studies, over 82% of the patients, or 82+% of the patients, never had to have hospitalization, right? And the response rates were also 82% overall response rates and 54% CR rates, almost identical to the inpatient academic transplant center hospitals. So I'm really frustrated why these therapies aren't being delivered. And these were well-designed studies, FDA agreed, it's mentioned in the label briefly. It's just, there's real data now that shows in 2 different studies that these drugs can be administered safely and effectively in these community settings, and I just hope the field moves in that direction.
We hope so too. You touched on a couple of things that I was going to ask, and I'll do a quick round here. So, one of the challenges that we've read and you have experienced yourselves, and when I was at the hospital, that if clinical trial data is not reflective of the real world population, there is a very definitive risk of leaving entire populations behind, right? And a lot of effort is done, but a lot more needs to be done to address the disparities, whether it is geographic, whether it's socioeconomic, whether it is, are we representing, the entire population, whether it's clinical trials or whether it's availability of the actual marketed product. So how can sponsors and developers address these disparities related to race, ethnicity, socioeconomics, geography? And from your perspective, you all work in different parts of the world. You have knowledge of other countries outside of where you work. So how can big countries like US, EU, UK, and also the smaller countries, what do you think can be done to address this particular issue of not leaving people behind?
Yeah, Rupa, before we get there, I mean, it's a really good question that we pose, but we need to convince the regulators and the HTA authorities to accept real-world evidence, and that we can't increase access and expand access to, some of the other countries until we can do that. And let me give you some, examples. I mean, the majority of trials right now that have gone through regulatory approval, either in the US or here in Europe, or even in the UK, are single-arm trials with small patient populations, right? So there's a huge burden to get that through and get a license from a regulatory perspective. And then you've all heard, I'm sure, over the last few days, and now you have the JCA. And in the JCA, in the framework, there was no mention of real-world evidence and how it would support, HTA assessment either during the process or then after the process. And we, working as part of the ARM organization, lucky enough to work, as a consortium, have just recently produced a white paper to say basically lobby the JCA and say, what are you doing here? Because otherwise, to your point, and then I'll close, if we can't get past that hurdle, we're never going to get to the point of being able to offer
Absolutely.
these therapies to those that really need them the most, because that's really what we're trying to do here. So I think, that's a part of the equation. But Panteli, I know you have some strong views on this topic.
Yeah, no, thank you, Dilip. I'm also kind of looking at it from a slightly different perspective. I'm very passionate about the patient advocacy group community. So, my advice is engage the patient advocacy groups early, because I think that they have a very important voice at the table. And I'm just kind of thinking about how that reflects you know, what the patient experience is, what it's reflective in terms of countries and regions. You know, we work very closely with the Lymphoma Coalition, the Global Lymphoma Coalition, when we were developing some very complex therapies in the lymphoma space. We put together a blueprint that was presented to their board, and it was ratified and endorsed in terms of how we would be working with these groups to really, again, be very reflective of patient-centered research and integrating that patient voice very early in the developmental paradigm. It's a very, very powerful approach that I think can inform the process further on down the line, you know, right through to, you know, really being able to kind of understand adoption and that reflection of almost the real world scenario in that case.
Makes sense.
So yeah, you know, again, a very, very critical area of the developmental process.
David, I wondered if, you know, you work in a little bit different space, you know, a space that holds a great promise and also changes certain things. So we would love to hear from you as to how you look at this challenge and how you would, you know, address it.
Yes, certainly. So what Rupa means is I literally went across the street from the Bristol Myers Squibb campus in Seattle, Washington to Umoja Pharmaceuticals, which is on beautiful Lake Washington. What we do is in vivo CAR T therapy, kind of picking up on that. It's a wonderful time to be in this space right now, simply because there's evidence that this possibly might work. I said this yesterday at my presentation. 10 years ago, I would have never thought you could inject these little particles and generate CAR Ts in a safe and effective and controllable way. And we see by the ESO biotech data that was mentioned earlier today and is out there now that led to a very nice acquisition and clearly a positive ROI for those investors. Importantly, too, companies like Therapeutics and soon us are treating patients with the same paradigms, or same CD19s and BCMA molecules that the ex vivo CARs are, but without all the hassle. Like truly, for the first time ever, you know, off-the-shelf therapies. Yeah. We make our products, we freeze them, and they're sitting now in 2 hospitals in China, 2 hospitals in Australia, and a dozen hospitals across the U.S. While we're enrolling patients. So I think that's going to be, you know, if it all pans out, the efficacy is not clearly out there yet, but if it pans out, I do think it's going to be an absolute game changer for off-the-shelf therapies, leading hopefully to even more access to remote areas. I always like to tell the story, like if you're in Walla Walla, Washington now, it's very hard, you know, it's the great wine country part of our state here, but it's very hard to get CAR T. You have to, you know, pick up and literally move your family hours away to you know, come to Fred Hutch Hospital, and it's just patients aren't doing it. I had the opportunity to visit with patients when I was at Juneau. That was the biggest stumbling block. I don't want to leave my provider who's treated me through 5 other lines of therapy. I don't want to leave my church. I don't want to leave my family and my support network to go to this scary hospital in Seattle, which they are scary. If you've ever been to any of those transplant hospitals, they're frightening for patients. So I think really, whether it's allogeneic or in vivo, I do think it's really going to be meaningful once we figure out the technology.
Definitely. We're looking forward to that. I think we're going to move to the next bucket, which is financial barrier. And all of you have worked in that space and are passionate about it. So we have all heard the term, it's used in many contexts now, therapies without borders, right? I think it's a noble term. I don't know realistically when that is going to happen. Dilip already, you know, said what needed to be said is the regulatory folks need to get on board. But we have discussed the barriers in US, UK, EU, Japan. The challenges are even more profound in other parts of the world. Meeting on the Mesa arm last year, we had representatives from Africa, representatives from different parts of the world where they're forming coalitions and doing things because it is difficult for them to access any therapies in the other countries. So what efforts, from your perspective as a leader in the field, are needed on a practical level to address global challenges? And I will start with you, Panteli.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a critical one, isn't it? I would say that, we need a rallying call, a call to action, to ensure that, we're bringing together stakeholders to ensure that we are removing barriers so that patients get access to transformational therapies. There's practicality. I also look at it in terms of how we think about these treatment centers, for example. There's many practicalities that we need to address as a community, but I think that we also can be very supportive of sites and hospitals. I was involved in a site coach approach where we were working with sites to really help them to reach potential levels and stringencies and accreditation so that there is a willingness to be involved, but I think there's also a way for us to have that interplay, to be sharing experiences and best practices around the practicality. But I would say that we do need this this call to action, to be much more concerted in our efforts, because at the end of the day, patients are waiting. And I think as a community, we have an obligation to remove those barriers and to get these therapies to patients.
I think the challenge for me is I agree with all of that. And I think that collectively, and I'm very fortunate to be in this group with these folks, is that we all feel the same way. I also think we can get in our own way, right? As we get together in these coalitions and groups, if the goal is to remove barriers for patients, then we need to look at it realistically. And I think we need to call each other out realistically. So when we talk about the regulators, I think we've heard a lot of the new processes here in the EU. I think we're all hopeful that they'll come together, but for those of us who are commercializing, we have to be really strategic in which country we're going, because we have to look at from a regulatory perspective and then from a pricing perspective, and those two things don't always meet. So I think that's the first barrier when we look at, if you go beyond the EU now and look at Africa and other countries, it's a tough thing to say, yes, we're going to go there, because we have to have the sustainability here. If we look at it from a US perspective, if we leave the EU and go to the US, can we do enough there from a volume and financially to carry us to the rest? So it's the chicken and the egg, but I also would say in all the countries, US, Italy, Europe, in anywhere we're going, collectively, we are causing our own industry to stall. So I would say be provocative, push the limits, and really see the barrier for what they are, because I think the quality, the efficacy, we are FDA-approved medications. So I feel very strongly about when you talk about accreditation and qualifications of centers is with real-world evidence, with the science that you did way back when, you were there, David, is that it shows from a quality efficacy, which is why we're seeing it expand into the community, and we're seeing changes from the FDA on these labels. It's safe, efficacious, and we are mandated by regulation that we give a good quality product, right? So I would challenge that, can we do this with all the other barriers in place? And I think sometimes we're making our own barriers by not speaking more boldly.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, as manufacturers, obviously the burden falls upon us, but let's get real here, For a startup like Autolus, if you look in the public domain, we've invested almost $1 billion in getting this one indication to commercialization in the US. I'd love to be able to go to my board and say, oh, by the way, we'd like to go to the MEA regions first and all, but I know what the response is going to be. Yeah. And that's the challenge. That's the reality of the situation. I think all of us, bar none of us, would all want to make our therapies available to as many, to Panteli's point, as many patients that need it. But there's always then the dilemma of, the financial piece, as it's called, in terms of then recouping the investment, the R&D investment, to launch the product, and in the time frame that you have that in terms of, IP, and then you've got the moral and ethical dilemma of knowing full well you may have a family member or relative or whatever where you can't make the product available, not even within the European region. I'm a member of the WHO forum to address this exact thing, and many delegations come to the forum and present their case but it's really then hard to take that back into your organization and say, hey, by the way, can we, go there? Yeah. But I think that, I hope that in time, the continuum will change as you get different types of cell and gene therapies, perhaps allogeneic cell and gene therapies, perhaps. The answer is supporting regional CAR-T development. Maybe that's one of the answers. I don't know. I don't exactly know what the solution is, but I do understand some of the dilemmas that we all face.
The one, I think, I was just going to add to that, the one sort of personal perspective from my sort of point of view is that one of our indications at Garuda is transfusion-dependent thalassemia. There are now, again, innovative and transformational therapies that are being made available for these patients. But I'm very close to, the International Foundation for Thalassemia, a very regarded, highly respected patient advocacy group in the thalassemia space. And, I have family members who are struggling and being challenged with this disease. So let's kind of think about where are these patients primarily? And it's the Mediterranean region, the Middle East, India. This is where we see the patient in terms of epidemiology. So again, it's kind of that obligation. We know that these therapies can make a huge difference in these patients' lives. We need to be creative in how we get there.
Agreed. Absolutely agree.
I think that's the solution that the last meeting on the Mesa people spoke about. You have to be creative. You have to maybe start drawing outside the box a little bit and not be afraid. David, you have anything to add from
I just want to share a very positive experience recently I had. As a little company, we're looking for novel places to run clinical trials where we're not competing with these likes of these characters here. And we actually had a very positive experience in Abu Dhabi. They built a clinic there that's basically a mimic of a Cleveland clinic, hired CAR-T professionals. When I walked in there, I couldn't tell whether I was there or at the Cleveland clinic. And I think that is very supportive of the idea that a little company or you hotshots can bring your product safely and effectively into countries like that. I can't say that's globally the situation, but it's a really nice example. Yeah.
No, but absolutely. I mean, you go to Saudi and you go to the King Faisal. Most of the physicians there qualified at UCL in London and have gone up and set up an amazing, facility. But it's then that commercial dilemma. So we got to figure out a way to either regionalize it or figure out some kind of mechanism to be able to
and keep talking about it.
Exactly that. Exactly that.
Thank you. We're going to move to another hurdle, which is barriers to patient access, and some of you have already spoken about it, but I want to understand a little bit more. We have about 12 minutes left. Actual challenges faced by providers. So CAR-T therapies, Phung, you mentioned, transplant centers, hospitals, trained staff, all of this needs to be in place, whether it's clinical trials or whether it's actual commercial manufacturing, right? The type of treatment that is required sometimes removes patients and their family members away from where they are because their provider isn't able to provide that, so they have to move away, make a lot of sacrifices, right? Especially in small, even in a remote part of, Iowa or Kansas somewhere. In UK, I'm sure it's the same in EU and UK. So practically, how do people address this issue? And who do they go to seek help when that happens?
Yeah, I think that, from my experience, it's, having sort of the formulation and the development of these white glove concierge type approaches. Let's kind of think about, the pediatric patient population, for example, where we're seeing, a lot of, very innovative therapies moving into rare and ultra rare indications. Certainly we have a very strong focus at Garuda in terms of pediatric patient populations as we think about bone marrow failure syndrome, for example. So, these are young patients that are going through a very intensive process. I think that, again, we're trying to be very creative around trying to almost kind of, be very intricate about the patient journey, But I agree with you. It's how do we sort of think about those services at the level of the hospital and center, that become, very sort of convoluted in terms of the demand, on the multidisciplinary sort of center and service. So we need to almost kind of democratize that process. But the ability to be able to do that has to come through sharing experiences, developing the tools, and again, going back to your question about who to go to, I think the patient advocacy groups, again, have a very, very important voice, because they understand the intricacies of what it takes to actually get that patient through that process. So those are just some thoughts from my side.
I think so, but look, a lot of these, I absolutely agree. Perhaps one of the solutions to, when you're talking about pricing and reimbursement and access is maybe a little bit more of a focus on innovative pricing mechanisms, one. Two, link that with as manufacturers, certainly the ones that I'm involved with, I think we offer little value at the moment, outside of bringing a drug with the potential to cure or create some kind of long-term, remission, and then we start trying to talk about innovative pricing, but when you end up having a negotiation with a payer, it ends up being a discount. That's the reality of the situation, whether that be in the UK, whether that be in Europe, and right now in the US, you just scratch the surface with it because patients are moving insurers and so on and so forth, and the complexity is enormous at the moment. But a few companies have managed to put some things in place for recently launched, gene therapies. So there seems to be, a mechanism to do it. But again, I think it just can't fall upon manufacturers. I think we need, somehow, the mindset of the payer needs to change globally. And they really do need to, I appreciate all of the issues, all of the resource required to manage outcomes guarantee schemes and so on, and all the things that they end up having a conversation about as to why they can't enter into an innovative pricing, mechanism process. But somehow, some way, we need to figure out, perhaps as an arm organization, because I don't think we'll do it individually, to sit down with these payers and say, you're going to have to come to the table. And I think we are going to have to put something on the table too, to take something away from healthcare systems for these mechanisms to operate. And I think that that's something that's a serious consideration in the next couple of years.
Any comments?
I go back and forth around the pricing mechanism is I agree with Dilip, is that we all say we want to come to the table and do something innovative, and I think you have to separate cell and gene because of the price points. And I think that really is where the barrier from the payer's perspective, regardless if it's in the US or worldwide, is that they don't separate that, but then there is the process, right, within from an overall cost. So I think the challenge is always going to be there, and I think, I don't know what the right solution is either. I think we've come up with a lot of things that maybe work for one but not the other. The flip side, though, from a positive perspective, I think, and I benefit from both Dilip and David for what they built in the programs between Kite and BMS, is what we've learned with the patient process, right? As we look at the patient journey, an obligation, I think, of all the companies, so as you're building your programs, is look through that patient journey and where can you make it easier for the patient? Yes. Either start from an advocacy standpoint with patient advocates to understand what that patient's really going through. And within your process, we've been given more lax in our patient services programs when you look at from a logistical perspective. And we learn from each of the early companies, and we've been able to work with OIG and others to expand the programs that support that patient. So when we look at that logistical nightmare for that patient and the caregiver, are there things within our program that we can do? And I would say from a cell and gene perspective, that is an obligation regardless of the size of your organization, because the selection for the patient isn't just about the drug, it's can I take on this next 4 to 6 weeks? Mm-hmm. The flip side of it is, I think with the science and the real world evidence that we have, we can go back to the agencies and say, hey, this is what we've learned. How do we make this better? What can we reduce? And you've seen that with the step down of the REMS programs in the US, but I would say that I'm optimistic that we will see more change that is to the benefit of the patient throughout that journey. So I think it's going to be a give and take from a pricing perspective, but in the meantime, what can we do to ensure that that particular patient has the best experience?
Yeah, and I think it's an evolution, just to add before we bring David in, I think it's an evolution. Look, right now, let's, again, be real. The COGS associated with CAR T-cell therapy are huge. And so it ends up boiling it down to that, and then how do you manage that? But that's going to change. It's going to change because, manufacturing processes are changing. You've got point-of-care manufacturing. The MHRA just introduced, a framework, and I think other European countries and in the US will catch on. So then comes, well, if those COGS come down and they become manageable, the term that I use and I've used in the past is then can we as manufacturers offer a wraparound service? And that's what Phung's kind of describing, right? Wraparound services. And we should, I feel, take the burden for that. For example, can you provide a nurse that do what Sarah can do, so do the monitoring, or can we provide some other digital, service? And I think those are the types of things that we're going to have to bring to the table for maybe payers to get really interested in some of these types of innovative pricing mechanisms. David, I don't know, do you have a view?
You're all being very nice to the payers, particularly in the US. I'm finding it astounding. I'm still astounded that they treat CAR T as similar to transplant as far as reimbursement when it's FDA approved, there's REMS programs in place, and I'm just astounded by that. And they use that as a defense mechanism not to pay for probably 30 to 40% of the patients that should get the drug.
I think the other thing to quickly mention is that managing the expectation of the patient. I think that, having spent many years, working with patients directly, you have to manage their expectation. And when we think about these processes, particularly for patients with acute leukemias or other hematological malignancies, there is a fear of relapse once the patient is actually waiting for that final product to be developed. So I think, again, developing the tools, engaging with the patient, and it's not just about the patient. It's also about the caregiver. So there is a unit that there's a framework, an infrastructure we need to build around the patient in order to influence and take the journey with them. So that would also be my recommendation to sponsors developing these highly complex therapies.
Important. I think a lot of times we focus on patient, but not the support system. I think the support system, no pun intended, also needs the support. We have about 2 minutes and 21 seconds. Before I open it up I just want to, one thought from each of you, something that is just burning inside of you as to how this access is going to change. It's not going to happen overnight, but it is going to happen by
I think all
leaders.
4 of us have touched on it. If there's anything that we can inspire you to do is to look at your patient journey from the start to the end and see how you can maybe change it to what it is today.
Great.
Because that's, to me, is what's going to change the next.
David, you have a different perspective because of the therapies you're dealing with now. I know you've dealt with CAR Ts.
We just got done making a video on the patient experience for the ex vivo CARs versus what we would expect in vivo, and it's obviously, any off-the-shelf, a world of difference, right? Both for the patient itself and particularly for the caregiver, right? It'll be just a lot different experience. No lymphodepletion, no apheresis. I'm getting highly concerned because we mentioned, and I know we want to talk manufacturing, but I do think this is such a wonderful meeting to see the manufacturing advances. I think the next problem is going to be hospital beds, right? We'll be managing hospital beds. How many hospital beds can Memorial Sloan Kettering build?
Or even apheresis units.
Apheresis
chairs,
units, right?
Yeah.
Right. I just think paying a lot more attention to that whole patient. I love your sentiment. The whole experience needs to be managed.
I mean, to your point, very quickly, if you look at the ophthalmology model, when where AMD, there was not enough chairs.
Yeah.
So vans came, and in car parks and all.
Right.
And we laugh, but if you go into autoimmune and, there's a talk on diabetes, all of these things, there's not going to be enough room in the hospital to manage these patients. So you're going to have to look at new ways to deliver, infuse those therapies.
Yeah.
I know we're not going to solve this problem today, but I do appreciate everything you have done until now in your respective roles to make it easier for the patients to make it easier for these therapies to come to market. And thank you again for a very insightful discussion. I don't know if anybody has questions, maybe a quick 1 or 2 questions we're happy to take.
Stunned silence.
It's lunchtime.
Well, I want to thank all of you for a really insightful conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.